Oh, look, it's obviously an important start. You have to have a discussion if you want to improve the relationship. But we shouldn't overstate the significance of this at this point in time. This was a meeting on the sidelines of the Shangri-La Dialogue, which occurs once every 2 years. It hasn't happened in the last 2 years because of COVID. And they had an hour-long meeting where they exchanged, in a frank and full manner, their respective views. That does not equate to restoring the status quo ante of the Australia-China relationship as it existed prior to 2015, when the relationship was reasonably good. We've got a long way to go before we could even consider that. And most of the issues that need to be resolved have been caused by China's actions, not by Australia's actions. So the Chinese have to meet us halfway. They cannot just essentially expect us to give concessions in return for restoring trade relations and that sort of thing.
Militarily, on May the 26th, the Chinese fighter jet aggressively challenged an Australian Air Force plane over the South China Sea in international airspace. What would have been said about this incident?
I'm sure Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Marles made it clear to Wei Fenghe that the behaviour of the Chinese pilot in that J-16 was highly aggressive and unprofessional. For the aircraft to fly directly in front of our P-8 aircraft and release chaff into the engines was incredibly dangerous, could have potentially brought that P-8 down with the loss of the crew. So there would have been, I would imagine, a strong statement by Minister Marles to Wei Fenghe in that regard. But whether the Chinese listened is another question. They could sort of nod appropriately, but really I don't think the Chinese would have taken that on board. I think that we should expect further aggressive behaviour by the Chinese in areas such as the South China Sea. And it's important to note that the Chinese are now trying to claim that the Taiwan Straits is Chinese waters, not international waters as it actually is. So there's a risk of this sort of thing happening in the Taiwan Straits too.
Yeah, so talk to us about some of those other significant defence issues that would have been discussed, Taiwan and China's growing assertiveness in the Pacific.
Well, the Chinese are making it very clear that they demand unification of Taiwan and China as part of the China dream. Now, it's important to note that the majority of the Taiwanese people do not want unification with China. They want to maintain the status quo. They don't necessarily want independence, but they want to maintain the status quo. That's unacceptable to Beijing. And so they're using, at the moment, political pressure and coercive pressure to try and convince Taipei to accept China's terms for unification. But if that doesn't work, the Chinese are making it very clear that they will use military force, if necessary, to force unification of Taiwan with China. And that would certainly amount to aggression. It would amount to an annexation of Taiwan against its will. And in the same way that Russia is using aggression in Ukraine, I think you could make the same case that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan that potentially could occur later in this decade would be exactly the same thing. In terms of the Southwest Pacific, you see the Chinese moving very aggressively to try and assert themselves to establish a forward presence. The agreement with the Solomon Islands was all about China establishing a forward base in the Solomon Islands. And we need to expect that to happen in very short order. And then you would see, for the first time since 1942, essentially a hostile military presence 2,000 kilometres off Australia's eastern seaboard.
Do you see anything in this first outreach being from Richard Marles, who during the election campaign was criticised by the then coalition government for, in their view, being too close to China?
Look, I think Richard Marles is doing a good job. I understand what the current opposition was saying about him at the time, but I think as Defence Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, he's doing an excellent job in terms of protecting Australia's interests. Obviously, when you engage in diplomacy, you have to, use a certain type of language and a certain type of approach to have a full and frank discussion. I think that's what Richard Marles is doing, but he's not essentially surrendering Australia's interests or Australia's values in that process. I do think we need to go into any future negotiations with the Chinese with our eyes wide open and recognise that it's the Chinese that created the problems in the relationship, not Australia. And so it is the Chinese that do need to meet us halfway and address some of the issues that they have created in order to have progress in any diplomatic discussion.